Seeing a presence of a quorum, I'm going to call to order this meeting of the Amherst School Committee at 5:31 on Tuesday, January 18th. And we'll start with a roll call attendance. When I call your name, please state present. Ms. Chow.
Present.
Mr. Harrington.
Present.
Mr. Dunling.
Present.
And McDonald present. And we have a few guests joining us this evening. We have Ms. Kathy Shane, Chair of the Elementary School Building Committee, Ms. Margaret Miner-Wood, who is our owner project manager, and of course, Dr. Morris, and Maylene Scott, our recorder. And our first item is public comment, and I'll just clarify, this is a meeting of the Amherst Elementary School Committee. We have one topic on our agenda tonight, which is our school building project. There is a separate meeting with a separate Google Meet that begins at 6:30 of the Regional School Committee. So any folks that are joining us and want to learn about or share public comment about anything on the Regional School Committee agenda, we ask that you please hold that and return to that meeting, which is a separate link at 6:30 p.m. So with that, I did not receive any public comment related to the elementary schools before this. So I see we have a couple guests from the public here. And so if you would like to speak to the elementary school committee, ask that you raise your hand and we'll call on you. I'm taking that deafening silence as not interested in public comment at this time. So we'll move on to our first item of business, which is a school building project timeline and community engagement. And knowing that we had just met last week, we had, this was a topic of, we had a regular update on the project from the building committee at that meeting last week, and we had a lot of questions and discussion about the visioning, ed plan visioning workshops, as well as what are the other opportunities for the community and the public to engage and participate in the process. And since there was a lot of work being done by the building committee, and Margaret's team wanted to bring us and not back together just a week later rather than waiting for the February meeting, because there's a lot happening between now and then. So thank you for everybody for accommodating this extra meeting. And thank you to Ms. Wood and Ms. Shane for being able to join us this evening on such last minute notice. So I will turn it over to, I think, Margaret, are you going to be presenting? Yeah.
Yep.
To take us through that. What we wanted to do was talk about the timeline with specific focus on when does the school committee need to weigh in and make decisions?
Right.
What is our plan for community forums and community engagement?
Right. So, yeah, I'll try to give a summary and answer questions. And I just want to say it is confusing. I mean, I've had to make, as the building committee knows, I've had to make myself a picture of it to see how it works. So what I'm going to show you is a kind of version of that. But it's kind of hopefully will help answer some questions because it's a picture instead of a narrative. So kind of big picture. When a school district is in the MSBA feasibility process, there are three kind of big major submittals that the MSBA, which is basically the bank here, right? They're giving you money without a mortgage, has for the project, and the initials, like you'll hear these so many times, you'll eventually kind of understand them. But I think at a very high level, the way to think about them is the first one. And I always say to people, it's kind of like you're talking to the bank. So the first one is the due diligence submittal. So it's the one where you say, this is what we have. This is the condition it's in. This is what we want to do. this is how we're, thinking about the approach. And that piece, because what you are teaching in the buildings drives the, the design process, also includes what's called the ED program. And I'll come back and explain a little bit in more detail about what is in the ED program. So think of this first submittal that we have to make, which is called the Preliminary Design Program, or the PDP. So you'll hear that term over and over again. What they're talking about is, you could think of it as the due diligence submittal. So that's one. In that submittal, the community, it's required that we bring in the consultant team bring in community response and describe the range of options that are going to be looked at in the next stage. So it's not a decision on an option. It's kind of sort of saying, here are the options. In this case, we know that we have 2 sites. We know that we have 2 enrollment sizes, and we know that we have to, as required by the MSBA, look at a renovation, an addition renovation, and new construction as sort of basic 3 options. So you can imagine this due diligence piece has that this range incorporated. Then the next step is, which I think is the thing that people are kind of really kind of most engaged in, is, other than the school committee, is which option is it going to be? And that's what's called the preferred schematic report, which is just a fancy name for saying this one's our preference. And then the last one, once that decision is made, the design team goes as far as they possibly can with detailing and estimating the cost of that option. So in the kind of big picture of what this looks like, the holidays is always a hard time to kick these things off, but it does have the value that we see between now and school vacation being the boundary of doing the due diligence piece and determining the preferred option. So that by the time we hit summer vacation, we will have had a whole series of community meetings, and there will have been presentations, and their building committee will have taken in that input and made a decision. So that's another way to think about this, is that in terms of the really active work of the community, it's the first 6 months. So now I'm going to pull up a schedule that then kind of breaks this down into a little more detail. Any questions so far before I do that? Where I complicate our lives with a picture. Now, I am not a GoToMeeting acolyte. It says I am not allowed to share.
Yep, you should be able to right now.
Now I am allowed to share. Okay. Everybody see that? Okay, it's on my other screen. So I'm going to fold up some pieces of this, but across the top here are the dates as we march it. I'm going to actually make this a little bit smaller so that it sort of takes us up through. Now you can see that it's taking us up through the first kind of 6 months of the project, right? They're just outside of, there we go. So this gray here, once we hit July, now we're sort of into the summer. And I will say that if you look at the rest of the schedule, I won't show it to you right now, it doesn't have as many like color boxes and things going on. But just to tie this back to what we're talking about, we've tentatively agreed that the preliminary design program, the due diligence document, which includes the ED program, would be submitted in the middle of March. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. And that the preferred schematic, which is we want to do this option, would be submitted at the end of June. That June 27th date is a fixed date in the sense that it's a milestone that the MSBA, they have regular dates by which you must make submissions. That's one of their dates. Okay, so you could think of all of this as sort of in fact, the way the schedule is built is I sort of built it from that. So I'm gonna actually now fold up these just so you sort of understand those drivers, because I want to focus on what's down below. So now there's a couple of different things that are happening. So the building committee is meeting approximately bi-weekly, and the school committee is meeting periodically. Now, when we make those two submittals, so, again, one is the due diligence, the PDP, both the building committee and the school committee have to take a vote to authorize the submission of these. So I've made a sort of placeholder here in early March. I don't know that you have a March 8th meeting, but around that time, you would need to have a meeting, take a vote. And again, as it relates to that June 27th date, which is the submittal, you would also need to have a meeting. There's a document that I have to submit that is signed by the chair of the school committee. So that's what's going in. So those are the two kind of structural places where you have to take a vote. So then, how do we get there? How do we get to the point that everybody feels like they know what's going on? So what we've laid out so far is two different processes that sort of intermingle a little bit at the beginning. The one is the public ed visioning. So again, the MSBA, it's very important to the MSBA, and I have to say I really appreciate this about their program. They really want to make sure that what you are teaching, how you are teaching it, and how you envision teaching is understood as a starting point, that the designers aren't designing a building that isn't interacting with, what you're teaching and how. So we had an initial visioning meeting. Hopefully you were all aware of it. It was the 13th in the morning. So it was last week in the morning. And then next week on the 26th. So that's Wednesday, we'll have a second meeting. And I'm getting ready to post tomorrow on the website the recording of the first meeting. Some of the material that is going to be covered is the same, but it's an opportunity for the design team to kind of reach out and ask for input from the community. And we had about 20 people attending, and it was a pretty robust conversation. I expect the second meeting, the January 26th meeting, which is in the evening, is at 6:30, to have more attendees. But we wanted to make sure there was an opportunity for those who couldn't. And then there'll be a wrap-up session on February 17th that summarizes what was gathered and heard and discussed in those meetings. In parallel, we've set up a series of community forums. Now, where the public ed visioning is specifically about, what is being taught in the schools and how, the community forum will be much broader, in the sense that it's going to look a lot more at images and concept and approaches to designing the building itself. As we've set it up right now, the first meeting, which is pinned down, I think now for February 3rd, is going to include an explanation, along the lines of what I'm doing for you all, of the schedule and the process. It's going to talk about what has been heard and learned in the ed visioning sessions, and it's going to talk about what has been seen and learned about the buildings and the sites. So the design team has already gone out and is doing their own kind of a side-by-side comparison of the two building sites. And then what's been proposed, although, we're hoping that this will work these meetings have tentatively been proposed to be in person, but if they're in Zoom, we want to do the same thing, which is to have breakout sessions where people are able to go into smaller groups and talk about a handful of items. So I would call this February 3rd meeting like a big kind of broad kickoff meeting for the community. And then the second meeting on March 2nd is going to be the design team coming back and summarizing what they've heard in all of these meetings, what they've learned from their investigation, what they've heard from the net zero working group, which has been set up, and what they have are starting to see in terms of evaluating the range of options. Again, there would be breakout sessions. Then there would be, at that point, they are really preparing, if you go back to up here, they're really preparing to put together that first submittal. So again, they're going to present, these are the options we're going to look at. What do people think about these? That all goes into a big submittal, which is a public document. And then they really start to look at how the options compare. We have not set a date for that, but the next meeting would be presenting their initial analysis for comment on the range of options, and then a more detailed look at that. And then change the color on this. And then the last one would be here, we think in June, where the final preferred option would be presented. I tend to think that meeting might be a little bit earlier than the second week of June, because we all know June gets crazy in the schools. So that's kind of the overview of the timeline. And I'm going to just stop and hear what questions you all may have.
Before I open up to questions, I just want to clarify, this is what you're showing is it's really just school committee and the community external to the district and the building committee. There's separate sessions that are happening internal to the district, correct?
You
that
mean
aren't on this calendar?
No, this is pretty much it.
But there's one with the teachers, I think, Margaret.
Yeah, there are I think a handful of meetings with the teachers, but Mike has been really clear that the whole all of his staff are under a lot of pressure right now. So we're trying to figure out ways to gather their input that don't involve dragging them into a lot of meetings.
Right.
So I don't have the dates for those right now.
Yeah. So said another way, those are happening and being planned. They're just not reflected on this timeline, correct?
That is correct.
Okay. Jennifer.
So let's see. The public ed visioning session. So I attended the 13th one and it was great. And the purpose of those is to give input or to collect input about the educational program. Is that right?
Yes, these ones in blue. That is the focus.
And so there's another one on the 26th, and then there's going to be a wrap up on February 17th where you all will, show what you've collected.
Yeah.
But my understanding was that the school committee is going to see the ed program on February 8th and then vote on it on the February 22nd. So
that's right.
How is the ed plan going to be submitted to us on February 8th if the meeting to show what you've learned doesn't happen until the 17th?
So good question. Essentially the way this is set up, I believe they're planning to bring it to you on the 8th so that you can preview it, summarize it for the public on the 17th, and then the intention was to have you take a vote on it on the 22nd. So there's actually you have 3 almost back-to-back meetings. I would say the one on March 8th is really, just confirming the submittal rather than confirming the program. But these 2 meetings, February 8th and February 22nd, are the ones where you would have an opportunity to hear what we had heard, what the team has heard on envisioning and ask your own questions and discuss.
I see Mike has his hand up, but I thought that we'd added the one on the 22nd so that was when we would hear the presentation with the vote on the 8th. But maybe you're
well. So again, I mean, you can take. I will say you can take and vote on the 22nd if you want to for the submittal. I just want to be clear that this red thing, this is about submitting the thing to the MSBA, and I think the designer's intention was to allow you to take a vote on the 22nd on the program.
Mike?
Yeah, and if I could add, my understanding from the DNISCO folks was similar to what Margaret said, maybe just said slightly differently, that they would have a draft after the first 2 meetings, as well as the meeting with staff, which I know Donna's been emailing me to schedule. And then there'd be an opportunity for the school committee as well as the public to see it on the 8th or whatever I think that's right.
Yep.
And then another opportunity for community input on the 17th, so that if there were modifications or edits and revisions, that there were 2 public opportunities before it would come to the school committee for a vote.
Right.
That was my understanding.
Yeah.
Irv.
Obviously, one of the most important parts of this whole process, and it was alluded to, is the education program, because that is the product that shapes what this building is going to be.
Correct.
So the question for me is that is the most important process, and the kinds of questions, issues, information, etc., that is brought forward is really important. We're talking about a building that's going to go up, that when it goes up, it will be way in the middle of the 2024 or beyond. And that, when you look down the road and into the future, there are all kinds of things are happening. And we know from what has happened with COVID, that there are a large number of items and issues that need to be addressed. When I think about it, I think about the future. I look at what does the future look like for a school building, when you're talking about a metaverse, or you're talking about augmented reality, or artificial intelligence, or virtual reality, and how those things impact what a school building looks like, what teaching looks like, etc. Those are enormous kinds of impacts, and those are going to be right front and center before this building is completed. And those things need to be taken into consideration in a serious way and presented in a serious way, so that we have a building that not only serves the mid 20s, but beyond, in terms of the students and parents. And so I'm really concerned that that process is something that needs to have robust input, not only from teachers, but also from community members and those who can look down the road into the future and say, hey, have you considered what these things are?
Mm-hmm. I agree. Would it be helpful? I shared with Allison earlier today what the MSBA is looking for in terms of program, because I think there's been a little bit of confusion, understandable confusion, about what is and what isn't in the ed program. I'm happy to share that as well. Allison, I'll follow your lead here.
That might be helpful. I did attach it to the agenda packet and shared it with the committee after you sent it. So
great.
I see Jennifer has a question. So maybe while you're pulling that up, we'll hear Jennifer's question.
Sure.
Yeah, so my question is actually relating to that document, which Allison did send us, and I took a look at it. It basically describes in a bit of detail what an educational program is. And it seems to me that it's pretty detailed and specific. Or it asks you to submit something that is pretty detailed and specific. So I guess my impression is that there are going to be a lot of decisions like baked into the educational program, the document. There's a lot that's going to go in there in terms of class size, delivery of services like ELL and special education, grade configuration. There's a lot of stuff that's going to get baked into the educational program. So I guess I guess I'm wondering, what are the things that are going to be baked in that I mean, I guess I feel like each of those things, and there are many elements of the educational program, I feel like each of them are things that we should discuss as a school committee, as opposed to just like voting on the document as a whole. And I'm having trouble wrapping my head around the timing, getting community input, talking about it as a committee, giving feedback to make changes to the ed program. Like it seems like it's a lot has to happen in the next several weeks.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess so related to that, I know that it's the school committee's responsibility to vote on and approve the educational program. Who is actually drafting it? Like, who is the person or persons who are drafting the educational program?
So what we're doing in this process is we're basically picking up the educational program that was written for the prior project and kind of taking it apart. And I really shouldn't use myself in this because it's the folks on Danisco's team who are working with Mike and identifying areas that need to be reviewed and unpacked, and possibly edited to reflect, first of all, making sure that all of these questions are answered about these pieces, but also, reflect how much the district has changed and evolved, and and the impact of COVID, for instance, since it was originally drafted. So I would say Mike is the leader as the superintendent, but he is being assisted by and interrogated by, if you will, the design team, Danisco's programming team.
Okay.
I think
Mike, is that a fair summary?
Mike?
I can wait. I saw Mr. Dunling's hand was up before mine, so but I'm happy.
Fine. Mike wants to answer the question.
I'm sorry.
If you want to answer the question, go.
Yeah, so I mean, I think some of these things in terms of school grade configuration, the school committees have already voted on that. Class size, this committee has a policy on that already. So I do think some of these things, unless the school committee is planning on changing those votes or those policies, are sort of already in place. In terms of the educational philosophy of the district, it really hasn't changed in the last 4 or 5 years in terms of student-centered progressive learning. And so, I think there are some pieces that came up in the last ed visioning, which are very, acute, and that certainly does need to be talked about. I agree with that point, but some of these things are, like teacher planning, room assignment, that's contractually based. So unless the school committee is going to change the contract with teachers, those things are already in place. School scheduling method, the same. So I think it's a long list of items, but I think unless we're changing contracts or policies, a lot of those other pieces they're not static because they do evolve over time, but I think for the MSBA purpose, they are already established. So, I mean, I think if the committee is interested in making some changes to those types of things, then certainly that'd be really helpful for me and the building committee here in short order, or to revise our timeline accordingly if this committee feels like it needs significantly more time to adjust those. And that's fine. I mean, it'll push back things, but if that's what needs to happen, that's what needs to happen.
And I think some of these things were already in our SOI and in the project acceptance. So like it's a K through 5 or with 575, or K through 6 with 300. I'm probably getting the numbers not exactly right, but
Right.
that's already there. So the questions about pre-K and the like and grade configuration were already answered in the SOI and the project brief from MSBA. Peter.
Yeah. So I guess on the general question of what goes in the ed plan and schedule and whatnot, I mean, I kind of look at it as it's up to us to what degree the school committee wants to insert itself to alter the schedule or go with the schedule and discuss what we want to when. I mean, it's up to us to do, right? And so I was going to say something similar to what Dr. Morris said, which is a lot of these decisions have already been made, and we're certainly free, at any time, or the school committee, to revisit our policy on class size or grade reconfiguration, or our approach to art. I mean, art programs. I'm just reading down the list here. But I guess the way that I personally, my view, approach this particular section of the MSBA process is that rather than an opportunity to from scratch do a deep dive on every single aspect of our education, which I'm not saying anybody's suggesting, but rather than do that, we start from what is established. We then talk about what we want out of this building, what's potentially changing with this building, what we might want to change, what we might want to discuss further, and then we go from there. I think it's an opportunity to raise some of these issues maybe that we haven't talked about before, but in terms of the schedule, I'm comfortable with what it is right now. So long as we really put a fine point in the next several weeks and months on communicating out the schedule and the opportunity. I can't stress enough, and I'll probably become a broken record over the next couple of years, so my apologies in advance. But just the way in which we take the information that was very clearly presented to us tonight, and formulate that in a way that is very digestible and shareable for the public, I think is very, very important. Like the spreadsheet that you just showed with all the little dates and stuff, that was excellent for me to digest in terms of understanding the process. Maybe not the optimal format for a public facing thing, and I think putting some effort into those what might seem like operational kind of administrative things is really important to make sure that people know and have as much advance notice about when those points of opportunity are coming up. Because even if we schedule enough opportunities for input on the various items, if people miss it, they can feel like there wasn't opportunity for input. And so that's which is equally as important when someone's eventually going to be voting to support this kind of a project. So, thanks.
Margaret, could you put that calendar back up on screen again?
Yeah.
Thank you. Irv.
I think it would be helpful to the public and to me and to everyone else who wants to have input into this process to know what exactly is already baked into this educational plan. There were some things that Mike mentioned, and I was thinking, all right, if those things are already baked in, then what are the things that the public can input on to impact the ed plan? And I also appreciate Mike saying, yeah, we could change it, but however, we need to know that this is the backdrop to it. And so I think that it would really, really be good if those things are put front and center to the public and up front, so that they know not only what the school committee is dealing with, but the parameters of the kinds of things they may be suggesting in terms of how that will go into the ed plan or not go into the ed plan.
I want to give a good example of one of the things that we've heard already that was the kind of thing that is not in the MSBA. That list from the MSBA isn't intended to be inclusive. It's a checklist, right? So one of the things that seems particular in the meetings, in the first public meeting that we had on the ed visioning, was the desire for outdoor teaching space. So, to me, that's a perfect example of what this process is intended to elucidate, which is that, and first of all, I think that's something that's become much more important because of COVID. But I would say even pre-COVID, there was an instinct in Amherst towards having outdoor teaching space, and that is a piece of your educational program, the desire to be able to take class outside and teach in various ways is something that is special and unique and important to the community of Amherst, and that would therefore be included. So, I mean, in some ways, I would say I would agree with Mike that many of the things that are on this list are things that you already know. And certainly I can ask the designers, the design team, to kind of present a comparison of the stuff we know and the stuff we don't know. But in some ways, it's the things that are kind of around the periphery of that, like the outdoor teaching. So it's not, there's on that checklist, it doesn't say, what about outdoor teaching? But clearly that's important to this community. So that's an example of something that's already come out of the public discussion.
Jennifer.
I have a question and a comment. My question is, so something like special education and the location of our elementary special ed programs, is that something that will be or should be part of the ed program, like determining where our special ed programs will be located? Is that part of the ed program and part of something that we will be, deciding on?
So yes, absolutely. And that's because in addition to MSBA looking at this design proposal when it comes along, it also goes to DESE for their review and approval. And in fact, a key change that I've seen in almost every project that I've worked on. I mean, people don't work on these projects on buildings that are 10 years old, right? I mean, this 50-year-old building, that's kind of typical. And the way the building was designed and has been used over time tends to sort of we often, but not always, find that it tends to create a situation where the special ed students are not fully integrated in a physical way into the school. That's very typical. And I mean, sometimes it's the worst in the buildings where there's the most space, right? Because it's like, well, we can, there's all that space down there. We'll go and use all that space. And then, that group inadvertently, becomes isolated. That is not something that, I mean, DESE looks at that closely. The MSBA looks at that closely. So it's a great question, Jennifer. What they will look for is a sort of approach to adjacencies and how to make the special ed programs more physically integrated and kind of thoroughly a part of the general education program as part of this. So what we need to know is, what the design team needs to know is, who's your, who are your kids? What are their needs? And then it's the role of the designers to come back and say, well, here is a way in these different iterations that we can integrate them.
Mike, you had your hand up earlier. Did you want to respond?
I think Jennifer she said a question in the comments. So I don't know if she was done yet.
My comment is on a different subject. So if you want to talk about this, I can hold. Thank you.
No, I'm good. I can wait. Thank you.
My comment is about getting input from educators. And Mike, I've heard you say a few times that our educators are overwhelmed and overworked right now, and I really appreciate that you're considering that. But I think that I think we need to give teachers an opportunity to opt in to give us input. Like, obviously it should be voluntary and shouldn't be required, but I don't want to not ask for input from educators or only make small asks. I mean, because we think that they're over, like, I think it should be up to the teachers to decide whether or not they want to take extra time and give us their input. I really think that that's going to be an important element of this. I mean, community input is important and family input is important, but families come and go and teachers are going to be the ones who are in the building. So it's really important to me that we get robust input from educators, while also trying to balance the fact that they're teaching in a pandemic and that's really difficult. But I want to make sure we're giving them opportunities to opt in to give us input. So that's just my comment about that.
Mike?
Yeah, so I don't think there's any difference between what you're saying and what I'm saying. And I think what Margaret is saying, we talked with Danisco, we're trying to find a time at 3:30. We're contemplating doing it this Friday because it is a teacher work day. And then we thought the better of it once we talked it through a little bit more. But trying to think right after school, trying to choose a day. So I think we're completely on the same page on that one. It's just being delicate because when they get an email from me saying this is an optional thing, not everyone perceives it as an optional thing because of my role. And I just want to be really conscious of that. It's something that I try to attend to, that yes, not everyone will come, but I want to really make it clear that they really don't have to go if they feel like they can. And that's really the focus. It's not about not having a session for staff to offer feedback. And just going back to the special ed programs, what I perceived your question to be, and maybe I'm wrong, Jennifer, was about literally the location of special ed programs, not so much the adjacencies and those pieces that Margaret talked about. At this point, and I think I said this last week, we've heard, speaking of hearing from staff, heard directly from staff, and this was actually talked about at school committee, I want to say 2 years ago, but Ms. McDonald probably remember better than myself, about, programs and splitting programs and the staff feedback on that. At this point, there's not particularly space at Crocker Farm in this scenario to move programs because they require not only specialized equipment, but a fair amount of space, just given the needs of students. So, unless we're planning on doing something really different at Crocker Farm that's beyond kind of what we talked about, which is making sure that the teaching and learning spaces and infrastructure is improved because it's a 20-year-old, right? It's not that much has been done in 20 years. That's not really something that we've engaged much. It's not that we can, it just would involve significant expense and significant change on approach that way. So I didn't want to leave that hanging because I thought I understood that you weren't simply asking, not simply, but asking about adjacencies. That's really important too. And we don't have the best models for it, as Margaret said, because our buildings are 50 years old and things get retrofitted, but not in the way that we would ever redo. I'll put it that way. But I didn't want to leave that comment not responded to.
Great, thank you.
Other questions or comments? I think I'll just add, because your question on special ed sort of just brought to mind also from that first visioning workshop, the conversation about building buildings for beyond what we can envision today, right? So we might be able to think about what we want a school to be in 2026 when we open the doors and welcome families and teachers and students into the building. But what we're trying to do is build a building that will last until 2070, and building that flexibility in a way that perhaps Fort River and Wildwood buildings were not constructed, right? They were constructed to a very specific program at the time that didn't allow for the kind of flexibility that we've talked about as wanting, right? Pandemic resiliency and sort of population changes, et cetera. And I think, when we think about sort of location of special ed as just one example, is we want to be thinking about designing space that doesn't prevent us from needing to make changes later, right? It's exactly what Dr. Morris just brought up about Crocker Farm isn't equipped right now with the space to house some of those programs. We want to make sure that we don't box ourselves into something in this new building. So I think it's hard to do as humans, where it's hard to sort of imagine sort of what we can't see back into 2070. But I do think that's one of the things is really thinking about resiliency and flexibility for being ready and capable of accommodating programs that we can't foresee today. Kathy, and then Mike.
Am I unmuted right now? Yes. I just wanted to just say a couple words because I am a novice in this, is what I should preface it at. I haven't been through it before, but I did have the opportunity to go and visit a few schools, and we intend to do some more. And what I saw, and these were schools that were built in 2020, 21, new, and for the most part, one was an ad reno, but when we say flexible space, they were showing me that walls that could be moved if you needed to. I mean, and one had done it one way. Another was small breakout rooms that could be used in this way or that way, or rooms between other rooms. So it was clear people were thinking in terms of space that could be multifunctional. And the one place, they had a particular teacher coming in, music teacher, on a Monday. And so many kids had signed up for that teacher that the art rooms were being used for music on the day that teacher was there, because everyone brought in their instruments. But I mean, it was a nice image of, they had built in a way to have multifunctionality in it, rather than dedicated space. So and this, two of the schools had high percentages of special needs, so they were showing what they had done with those populations. So looking at that, both current and in future, they look like they could adapt over time because of the way they'd been designed. It was just helpful for me to see real life examples of what are we talking about. That's it.
Thanks. Mike?
Yeah, just briefly, I wanted to share two other thoughts, because I think Jennifer's comments and questions are really good, and they got my mind going. So that's a good thing. Maybe not good for the 9 o'clock region part of the meeting. I don't know if my mind will still be going at that point, but good for right now, which is one is just another piece of feedback that I'm really hoping to receive from the community as well as staff is the integration or degree of integration to the Comandantes program in the new building. Because that's something that, as opposed to special ed, which has more regulations, rightfully has more regulations and rules to it than most other areas of school, Comandantes is pretty open. And so I would love feedback. And I was also reminded myself about the special ed question. One of the reasons we really wanted to have the special ed programs in the same building as Comandantes is that way we can ensure that participation in Comandantes is not dependent on whether you're in or not in a specialized program. In other words, if we divorce those two, if specialized programs are at Crocker Farm, then we're forcing a choice on a family about what's more important, being in a specialized program, meeting their special ed needs, or being part of Comandantes. We do have students, and we do want students to participate in a dual language program, or at least families have the opportunity, regardless of what specialized program their needs the kids have. And if we separate them too much, we wouldn't have that capacity. So I'm sorry, it just took me a while to loop back to that. But I think the Comandantes one is a good one. And perhaps if I was reoffering feedback to Margaret and particularly to Danisco, who are running these visioning sessions, maybe being a little more intentional about asking questions around the Comandantes piece would be, that'd be really valuable feedback, because that is a unique quality of the school, and we don't have the constraints around some other areas that sort of are predefined. This is a unique opportunity. We've done it, at Fort River. We've got 3 grade levels going. Fort River is a really funky building now, like Wildwood, with these like huge spaces and not a lot of small spaces. It's nothing that we would replicate. But when we're thinking about a different model, whether it's ad run or new, but new spaces, I think that's one that I would really love to hear community feedback at the next session. So I'm cueing Margaret to remember that for the next time, as well as Kathy.
Oops, couldn't find my unmute button. Did you have a comment, Margaret?
Sorry. What kind of input on Comandantes would you like to get, Mike?
So just casually, I've received input of some people who want it to be sort of like their own wing, and other people who really want it to be connected to the grade level partners.
Okay.
So like, I've seen this in dual language schools I've visited where, let's say there's like 5 first grade classrooms, you might have 2 Comandantes and 3, and they're all adjacent, and first grade has its kind of section, and other models would have Comandantes, K to 5 almost in their own sort of distinct wing. And I think there's pros and cons.
How integrated they are.
Yeah, absolutely. And how defined is it in the building versus not defined? And, I think that'd be really an interesting topic, because I think we're thinking about like, what feedback do we want? I think that's how this conversation sort of got rolling. And that's something I'd be particularly interested in hearing from staff and families on that particular question. So sorry it's a little bit of a tangential one, but I think this conversation has been really helpful in pushing my thinking on it.
I will pass that along to Donna.
Jennifer.
On the topic of Comandantes, I don't know if this is the right place to talk about it though, but I would love to explore whether it's possible. So my understanding is that there's currently 2 Comandantes classes per cohort. And is it possible to increase that to 3? Might there be opportunities for more students to be able to take part in the Common Activities program? I don't know how the teaching model works, or if you can have an odd number, but I don't really know. It's just something that I've been thinking about.
Nick?
So it would involve a couple things. One would be a change in model, because right now our model is we try to get 50% of the classes to be, or as close as possible to have Spanish language background. We pretty much max out with our current demographics. Demographics will change, but at the current time, if we move to additional section, it would change the model that we would have. So that would be one challenge. I think finding the appropriate staffing is a problem for all dual language programs, and so I think that's another pretty significant challenge. So at the time being, my instinct would be the model's going well. We have excellent staff, and what I don't want to do is dilute the quality of our staff, and also dilute the kind of Spanish language influence and the pure learning that's in our model. I think over time our demographics definitely will change, and I think to the earlier point that Ms. McDonald made, I think building the school with the flexibility that who knows what that model. I mean, could we have a dual language program with a different model or a different language in the right? I just want to keep those doors open, but I think kind of what looks like a minor change of adding another section triggers a whole number of other sort of unanticipated consequences that would kind of force us to really re-envision what the model is.
Are there any other questions? Peter, I'm
Yeah,
just
real quick.
conscious of time, so
Yeah. So Ms. Wood or Ms. So Kathy or Margaret, if in the near future you come up with like a nicely formatted presentation, not presentation, but a image or thing that we could all share. We all have social media and
I actually
emails to some degree. More than happy to amplify.
Yeah, I sent a subset of this image, kind of incorporate. Oh, you can't see this. Just encompassing the public ed visioning and the community forums and what the topics were, to our graphic designer today to ask him to make something that can be, featured on the landing page of the website and distributed. And I very much have my eye on the fact that Friday is one of Mike's newsletters going out. And my goal is to get it into the newsletter so that there starts to be a picture that people can see the dates for. So hopefully that I can make that happen this week.
Okay. Well, thank you again, everybody, for joining this sort of extra meeting. I think it was a helpful conversation, discussion, since our next meeting is not until the 8th. Just on that subject, a group at our last meeting, Jennifer and I volunteered to sort of work with Kathy and team on some outreach work. So we did meet today on that. And talking about sort of forming, creating more of an official advisory committee on outreach to really tackle some of these questions that you just raised, Peter, and that we all raised last week during our full committee meeting. So more to come on that. And with that, I will make a motion that we adjourn. Is there a second?
Second.
Moved by McDonald, second by Shao. And we'll take a roll call vote. Mr. Rhodes.
Rhodes, aye.
McDonald, aye. Mr. Demling.
Demling, aye.
Mr. Harrington.
Harrington, aye.
And Ms. Shao.
Shao, aye.
We are adjourned.